very much happening in the neighborhood in terms of overwhelming positive economic change. Pakistan went through a series of crises. Bangladesh had a number of issues. Afghanistan was still seeking stability. Nepal saw a period of conflict and then returned. And India seemed to be politically stable in many ways as compared to its neighbors. The economy was doing well. And yet on every single social indicator, by the time we reached year 2000, India was behind Bangladesh. And if you want to get a sense of what the region looks like today, just in terms of how India ranks in terms of its social indicators, the gross national income per capita in India, we were ranked number 3 in South Asia, now we are number 4. In 1990, now we are number 3. In life expectancy, we were number 3, now we are number 6. Infant mortality, we were number 2, now we are number 5. Under 5 mortality, we were 2nd, we are now down to 5. Maternal mortality, we stay pretty much the same because the rest of South Asia has not caught up. Total fertility rate, which tells us whether the population is stabilizing or not. It's a good indicator of development. We were number 2, now we are number 4. We don't have clear data for Bhutan or Nepal in case of underweight children. But if you look at proportion of underweight children, we are pretty much the same because again that's the area where South Asia is not doing very well. Child immunization for DPT we're down to number 6 from number 4. Measles we're down to number 6. Mean years of schooling we were probably 2nd or 3rd. We're now right there in the bottom. So something fundamental is happening here. That India, which considers itself to be a big brother, which does not have any hesitation in interfering in the affairs of its neighbors or flexing its military muscle or tries to play the great game, whether it's in Afghanistan or in other parts in South Asia, has somehow managed, despite its economic prosperity, to slip behind almost every single one of its neighbors. And that I think is something that we as a nation have to reflect on, and it's important for South Asians to reflect on, so that you don't follow the same trajectory that we have followed and end up where we are. I'm not by any means suggesting that in terms of peace or in terms of security or in terms of other issues or in terms of the standing that it has globally, that India is way ahead, is way behind its neighbors. I'm not. There are many positives about India, not least the fact that it has had an uninterrupted democracy for the last 60 years, and it has, which with a brief interruption in during the emergency, and it has had a strength, emergence of a very strong set of institutions, which is one feature that distinguishes India from its neighborhood, be it the Election Commission, be it the courts, be it the Human Rights Commission, be it institutions of parliamentary democracy. That's one feature that distinguishes India perhaps from its neighborhood, or an independent media, because these are things that India has can legitimately and justifiably proud of. And yet this is a country where 46% of children are malnourished. And to give you a sense of what that means, the rate of stunting for South Asia is for sub-Saharan Africa is about 27%. And if you look at India's child malnutrition rate compared to some of the poorest parts of the world, which are not doing very well economically, you have a situation where India is way behind. If you look at an indicator, say like low birth weight, what is the birth weight of a baby when it's born? It's a very important indicator, not just because it tells you about the child and is linked to the nutrition of the child or the nutritional status of the child in later years. It's an important indicator because it also reflects on the status of the mother. India, if you take the African average for low birth weight, about 15% of African babies are born with a low birth weight for all of Africa, which means that many parts of Africa have a lower than 15% low birth weight. India has close to 30%, 1/3 of babies in India who are born with a low birth weight. So it's not just in child malnutrition, it's also in low birth weight. if you take sanitation or access to sanitation, every day 52% of the open defecations that happen anywhere in the world, 52% of all open defecations in the world happen in India. Only 31% of Indians have access to individual toilet. You know, so this is where we really are after 20 years of growth. And if I had to sum all of this up, I would say that in these last 20 years, in the decades of the 90s and the 2000s, India seems to have prospered, but Indians have not prospered. A vast majority of the country has been left behind of the growth story. So everything you see in Delhi, the malls, the buildings, the institutions like this, they comprise a very, very, very tiny part. They represent a very tiny part of the Indian growth story. A large part of India has been completely left behind this growth story. If you look at some statistics again, one thing that India has done well, despite the hunger and malnutrition, and that is the tragic irony in India, and I'll just in subsequent slides show you how tragic that irony is. India actually fares much better than its neighbors on, say, food production. So if you look at the neighborhood, India for the last 20 years has not only been producing enough food for itself, it's a net exporter of food. And every year we are exporting close to 10 million metric tons of food. We're not just, so we not only have enough food to feed ourselves, we have enough food to export. That's not the case in, say, Bangladesh, which has a very high net deficit that is met from rice exports in India. That's not true of Nepal, which has a very, very small surplus, but is still dependent on a large amount of food imports. It is true of Pakistan. Pakistan is doing reasonably well, particularly in some commodities. It has a healthy food production. And if you look at Sri Lanka, not too bad, but nowhere close to where India is, even in terms of per capita issues. And yet, this country, which is producing enough and to export 10 million tons of food grain, when you look at the global hunger index, it's not very clear here, but basically the red is where it's really alarming. And so there's some parts of Africa which is doing worse than India. And now the global hunger index uses three very simple indicators. It uses per capita consumption, calorie consumption, what percentage of the population is consuming less than 1600 calories. It looks at the infant mortality rate, and it looks at the child underweight rate. So it's a very elegant index composed by the International Food Policy Research Institute, which looks at just these three variables. And out of 88 countries that are ranked every year, India is typically between 62 and 66. And some Indian states, because India is a large country, some Indian states are larger than most countries in South Asia. Some Indian states would be right in the 80s. States like Bihar, states like Jharkhand, states like Madhya Pradesh, they're right at the bottom. If they were individual countries on the global hunger index, they would be in the lower 80s. Out of 88 countries ranked, they would be right at the bottom. If you look at the changes that countries have made, the improvement that has happened, as compared to other countries in Asia, India has actually not improved as much as, say, Vietnam has, or Mongolia has, or Indonesia has, or even as much as Nepal or Sri Lanka. So not only is the problem constant, but there is no signs of improvement. In 1999, when the National Family Health Survey was done, 47% of Indian children were malnourished. 47%. When we came to 2005, when the next National Family Health Survey was done, 46% of children were malnourished. We registered a 1% decrease in child malnutrition. A 1% decrease in child malnutrition in the years when we had on an average 8% growth. So we were growing, the economy was growing at 8% or more. It was the fastest growing economy in the world. And yet at that stage, we managed to reduce our child malnutrition rate by just 1%. And typically, if you look at the graph on India's growth, from, we had what we used to call the Hindu rate of growth, hovering around 2%, well into the 60s and 70s and 80s, and then it started peaking in the mid-80s, and then post-liberalization, India really grew at a very, very fast pace. The growth that is now decelerating, and we may just about manage 5.5% this year. But this is the story of how India grew to be the second fastest economy of the world. And this graph really, for me, exemplifies what is happening in this country. The blue line is the growth in population. The black line is the growth in food grain production in India. And the red line is the growth in GDP. Okay? So it tells you very good news and it tells you very bad news. So the good news is that food grain production has in India in the decades from the 60s onward kept pace with the growth in population. Okay? So we produce enough food, as I said earlier, to feed our population. The good news is that the growth in GDP has been phenomenally more, beginning with the 90s. But what the story also tells you, and which is the bad news, and which tells you why the India growth story has been so inadequate, is that food grain production, the divergence between food grain production and growth in GDP. 60% of this country is dependent on agriculture. If there is such a wide gap between GDP and agriculture growth, what it tells you is that the agriculture sector has not been part of this growth story. So what it tells you is that a lot of other sectors have been growing, but agriculture has not been growing. There are news of starvation deaths and farmer suicides from across India from time to time. Unemployment increased from 4% to 8% in 10 years till 2 years back. It's improved now. We have a falling per capita food availability. We have stagnant agricultural production. We were unable to meet the growth target of 4% in agriculture for many years. We had an infant mortality rate that is stuck at around 60 per thousand, whereas in countries like Bangladesh, it's now down to 46. Our immunization coverage actually fell in 5 years from 60% to 40%. More than half of Indian women are anemic.